Good morning. At least it's morning for me right now. I'm going to be talking about Chapter 5, which deals with board governance. And I want to say a few key things about this chapter to maybe give you a little bit more insight. So, the Lawler and Worley model is assuming that all organizations have boards of directors. Now, you know from me mentioning on the discussion boards that, in fact, only about 1% of all U.S. organizations are publicly traded, and those are the only ones legally required to have a board of the for-profits. That said, I think there is, in fact, tremendous value in organizations having boards of directors, regardless of whether they're publicly traded. So let's dive into some of the issues raised by Lawler and Worley in this chapter. Okay, so first of all, they assert that the role of boards is, in fact, substantively different for SMOs than it is for CCOs or HIOs. And I would say, at least in theory, that should be true, and one would hope so in practice as well. So, whereas boards of directors typically are only responsible for representing shareholder or owner interests, what Lawler and Worley are arguing for is that we want multiple stakeholders represented, and we need to take that multi-stakeholder approach if, in fact, what we're hoping for is a sustainable organization. At the same time, we want to make sure that these boards are not getting into the details of day-to-day operations, but rather they're focused on the future. That nice term that Lawler and Worley use to signify strategic planning or strategic thinking. They talk about futuring. Now, in truth, I don't care which term you use. All that matters is that ultimately we need people associated with the organization who are thinking about the long run. Okay, so what should this board look like? And Lawler and Worley again discuss a variety of characteristics. I think some are more important than others. I'm not sure that all of them are in fact necessary to a board being effective. This is, like many other things that Lawler and Worley talk about, not necessarily substantiated in data or in research, but rather their opinion. So I want you to keep that in mind when you are looking at your organization, for example, the one that you're examining for your sustainability audit. Please don't assume that the Lawler and Worley word is gospel. It's absolutely not gospel. Some of what they say makes sense all of the time. Some of it makes sense some of the time. And it's your task to figure out under what conditions does some of the time make sense. Okay, so number one, the issue of independence. And this is, in fact, a long-standing research question. Is it better to have a board made up of entirely independent directors? In other words, nobody works for the organization. They don't have another appointment. They're not a manager, for example. They don't have some title. Well, the research is split on this. And so be careful as you assert your opinion about this, because you want to think carefully about, well, what kind of organizations, for what kind of organizations is that board member independence absolutely critical? And under what circumstances does it make sense to have at least some insiders on that board, some folks who know what's going on a regular basis? So again, we want to be careful. There are positives and negatives associated with both situations, and there's plenty of literature out there that will talk about this. You just have to key in insiders on boards. A second point talks about who needs to be on the board in terms of stakeholder groups. And Lawler and Worley assert, I think correctly, that we really want to try and have all key critical stakeholder groups represented. Whether we're talking about shareholders, they still need to be represented, employees, customers, people who live in the community in which the organization operates, etc., etc. All of those different perspectives will prove valuable. The notion of difference leads us into the next category of characteristics, which is diversity. And there's a pretty compelling case for diversity on boards and on top management teams. And the compelling case is that when you have diversity, you have more creativity. You have a greater chance at innovation. And if you keep in mind what the board is really all about, again, the focus is on futuring, then you can see where this creativity, this interest in innovation is really important. We need people who can see the same situation, the same future, if you will, from different perspectives so that we can identify best strategies for going forward. That said, diversity can be really challenging. When you've got people who have very different perspectives, it can be difficult for them to get on the same page. So this will require some very careful management. Expertise, we've got to have all of the different functions represented. That's critical. We also have to have people who know how to lead organizations. That's critical. We need people who know what makes people tick, because as Robert Reich, who under the Clinton administration, he was the Secretary of Labor, has said many times, the key distinguishing factor for any organization, that which gives it any sort of competitive long-term hope, is its people. Not its equipment, not its location, not its technology, its people. The people are responsible for making all of the rest of it work. And we want our board to understand this, to understand the value of human capital. What we called in the old days personnel, then we called human resources. Now we're calling human capital and talent. Lawler and Worley also talk about, how many boards should these directors be on? And they assert, frankly, with no research evidence, that we really need these people to have a minimum number of board memberships. And their argument is that being a director on a board for an SMO is more time and labor intensive. And I think there is something to that. That said, I don't think it's a good idea to constrain people. What you really care about with your directors is their performance. Are they doing what you need them to do? And as long as they are, who cares how many boards they're sitting on or what else they have going on? That's their call. Frankly, each of us has a differential capacity when it comes to the amount of work that we can take on and do well. Early in the semester when people were introducing themselves, I commented that, for example, somebody working full-time taking 3 graduate classes was really taking on an extraordinary burden. And I would stand by that point. That said, it's not up to me to tell you what you can do. Some people simply have more capacity than other people. So we need to be careful with that. The last point is, the process that we use to choose board members needs to be transparent. And what we're talking about here is a concept called procedural justice, in that we want the procedures that we're using to be really clear. We want the selection criteria to be really clear. That doesn't mean necessarily that we're making public all of the information that we're considering, all of the specific information, but we are going to let people know, okay, these are the criteria that we used. All right, so that really sums up the Lawler and Worley take on board membership. The next is the issue of leadership. Can you have a CEO who also serves as the chairperson? This is another area that's very rich in the literature, and the term that's used is CEO duality. And again, you can make arguments both ways. On the one hand, that the CEO and the chair position should be separate. On the other hand, that there's some value in having them occupied by the same person. I think this is, again, an organization by organization decision. It's a function in part of, for example, is that person the founder of the organization? Are you going to tell the founder that he or she shouldn't be occupying both positions? I think you can make a good argument for why the person might want to do only one or the other, but ultimately, it's the founder's baby, and that person may, in fact, in some cases at least, be the best person to see the long-term future, to understand the importance of sustaining the organization. Again, the literature has lots of evidence supporting either side. I think what it comes down to is, what are the key contingency factors that really influence whether one person should be occupying both roles? And, you can think of some of them immediately. Number one, how much time does the person have? How large is this organization? Is it on a growth spurt, etc.? Second, who are the other officers of the organization? What is their interest in the long-term future of the organization? How supportive can they be of that top person? Third, what about the rest of the directors on the board? Again, what are their interests? What's keeping them um, interested in this particular organization and focused on its long-term future? How competitive is the industry? Are we having to fight tooth and nail to maintain our position? Are we able to try new and interesting things? Is there any slack in that overall system? Those are just a few examples of contingency factors that we need to consider. The next thing that Lawler and Worley tackle is the notion of committee structure. If you were to go to edgar.gov, so edgar.gov, and look up any publicly traded company, let's say Procter & Gamble, you will be able to find for that organization what's called their 10K. Some of you already know what that is. And I encourage you, the rest of you, to go ahead and go look at one of these. And basically what it is it reports on the organization's activities. And there's a lot of financial information, but there's other information as well, including, for example, the committee structure of the board. Now, keep in mind, if you're imagining the org chart, you've got, the CEO, the top management team, the board's over here. The board has its structure, all those committees, and then the organization has its structure, the departments and so on. So these committees over here are really responsible for keeping the board running, number one, and they also have a human capital interest. So they need to have a committee, a group of people, a subgroup of people who are always focused on sustainability issues. They need to have a committee, a subgroup of people who are always interested in social responsibility issues. So here we're talking about the ethics of the organization. From, we follow the law, whatever the law is. If there isn't a law for something, then we're not as concerned. All the way over to the other end of the continuum, which is we're very proactive. We're ahead of the law. So again, somebody needs to be paying attention to this. Next, human resources. What you'll see with most organizations, most publicly traded organizations anyway, is that they have a subgroup that deals with executive compensation, but not necessarily considering the big HR or human capital or talent management issues for the organization. And Lawler and Worley, I think, are arguing correctly that this is essential and necessary. And again, it all comes back to what Robert Reich said. I mean, it's more than 20 years ago that he was saying this, which is, what makes a difference one company to the next? One is successful, one is less so. Besides all of the things in the environment that affect organizations writ large, it's the people. It's the people who comprise the organization. Good leadership, good followership, people who are encouraged to be innovative, people who are compensated accordingly. That's what differentiates organizations. And then finally, the committee they talk about is one that looks at organizational effectiveness. So, what's that all about? Well, here are our goals. Are we meeting them? If not, why not? If not, how do we close the gap? How do we move forward? How do we align what we say we want to do with what we're actually doing, with the structure of our organization, with the policies and the procedures that we have in place? Next topic, succession management. So, have we figured out when this CEO is done, when the rest of the top management team is ready to move on, how are we going to replace these people? And Lawler and Worley talk extensively about the issue of internal versus external candidates. And again, I think this is an issue that has no one right answer. We need to avoid trying to find the one right answer. We learned a long time ago, it's more than 80 years ago in the management literature, that doesn't work, because different organizations are facing different contexts. They, of course, have different people who comprise them. They have a different sociocultural context, a different environmental context, a different political context. I mean, I could go on. But the point is, because the external environment that they face is so different, the internal environment is going to be different. So what makes sense for one organization might not make sense for another. There's a strong argument for choosing internal. There's a strong argument for choosing external. This goes along also with how do we compensate people. And I'm going to give you one phrase on this. You compensate to encourage a focus on sustainability. And if that means long-term stock options, so be it. Again, bottom line, everyone needs to be focused on the long-term sustainability of the organization. The end.